All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the last class of Herstory 2.0. What we were just listening to there is the duet Nothing But the Grave from Harriet Tubman, When I Crossed That Line to Freedom by Nkeiru Okoye. So my name is Kendra Harder. My pronouns are she, hers. And a huge thank you to the Saskatoon Symphony Orchestra and Executive Director Mark Turner for allowing us to have this second class and for hosting. Thank you. So I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land where we are gathered and live streaming from is Treaty 6 territory, the traditional territory of the Cree, Dakota, Nakota, Dene, Saulteaux, and the homeland of the Métis. We pay our respect to the Indigenous ancestors of this land and reaffirm our relationship with one another. We encourage you also to take a moment to consider the Indigenous land on which you reside and offer a sense of gratitude to the Indigenous people who stewarded this land and water long before us. Every week I always ask this, and I'm going to ask it again. Please put it, if you're watching us, feel free to put where you're from in the chat. We love seeing where you're from. This time we're not having a power outage, so Matt will be able to say hi right back, which is awesome. And speaking of, helping me on technology again is Matthew Praxis, so please everybody give Matt a huge round of applause. And then you'll also notice below, so we've got the chat, we've got the Q&A. In the Q&A, please feel free to put any questions that you have throughout the class, and we'll do our very best to get to them at the very end. Since it's opera week, I might really struggle to leave time, but I'm gonna do my best. And before I get started, I just wanted to highlight yesterday's panel once again. We had a trans and non-binary composer and musicians panel, and the video will be available on the Saskatoon Symphony Orchestra's YouTube page. So do check that out while it's still up. It was such a lovely panel, and we were so happy to have those guests. So thank you, Saskatoon Symphony Orchestra, for hosting that panel. So this week we are talking about opera, one of the biggest sacred spaces of the male classical music world. And so inside of that, we're going to see what women have done with opera in the past and what they're doing today. So this quote here comes from Patrick Hansen, who is a part of Opera McGill. And he says, opera has been around for almost 400 years. And for almost all of those 400 years, it's been written by men and produced by men. So, opera, what is it? When did it begin? So it began as an experiment looking at the concept of carrying theater forward with music and through song. Part of the experiment was also finding a way in which to deliver the song in a way that people could understand. So this, we're looking at like late 16th century, and so at the time the predominant vocal music was like polyphony, which is several independent lines overlapping one another, and then with the madrigals there was very ornate and elaborate text setting. So both of these made it very difficult for to understand speech. So one of the defining elements of opera that emerged from this is what was called stile representativo, or acting style, or as we know it today, recitative. And so this is when the characters would speak to one another, and the singing is characterized by more the rhythmic pacing of language as opposed to those like long singing lines, held notes. Pardon me. And also the music setting was quite simple, so like maybe like a single line or a single note that just holds while they sort of sing over top of it, and then as they maybe come to an important turn of phrase, those notes change, sort of alerting the audience to the importance in the speech. The other style of singing that was used in tandem with acting style was what was called singing style. And so this had more expression and some repetitions of words and phrases, more elaborate lines. And so what would make up early opera was this combination of acting and singing style, which would eventually morph into how we know of opera today with the makeup of recitative and arias. So for those of you who don't know, recitatives then is that sung dialogue. So if you're thinking about a musical, it's like all of the dialogue in between the big numbers, and the big numbers are the arias, these big grand kind of concert songs that show off the voice and really get into maybe the heart of the matter and the characters' sort of intentions. They're big moments, these arias. So the first opera that was written, as far as we know, was by Jacopo Peri in 1598 with the opera Daphne. And in 1600, he wrote an opera called Eurodice, which is off of the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. And there's some music that survives of this. So Eurodice was written for the wedding of Maria de' Medici and Henry IV. And like many operas at this time, operas were usually composed or commissioned for a grand event. But as opera gained in popularity and we have our first opera houses opening, operas began to be written and then performed for seasons. So lots of, repeat shows, repetitions, just like on Broadway. And then eventually they'd even go on tour kind of around to other Italian cities. But that was just sort of considered the first grand masterpiece, mostly just because we have the music for it, but it is often mistaken as the first opera, is Orfeo by Claudio Monteverdi, which was in 1607. So that's kind of all I'm going to give on the history of opera. I mean, you could take classes on it, but we want to look at women in opera because that's what this is the focus for. So let's start with looking at how women as characters were treated in these operas. So in Eurodice, with the Rinuccini libretto, the story begins with the death of the bride. Now, because that particular setting was for a wedding, Orpheus actually rescues Eurydice. In the Strigio libretto, Eurydice is left in hell because of Orpheus's idiocy. Then there's the opera Daphne, which is about Apollo's attempted rape of Daphne. Monteverdi's second opera, Ariana, is where a woman is abandoned by her lover on an island. So while opera evolves over time, sadly, the treatment of its female characters does not fare much better. When we get to sort of like the heyday of opera, like the Romantic era, women are constantly dying. There's this trope that women were made beautiful by their suffering, and we see that in characters like Violetta, Mimi, and Aida. So this quote comes from Michelle K. Telford, Saskatoon, and she says this: "If you're a young, innocent woman or an older, experienced woman, it doesn't matter. You die." And that seems to be the woman's portrait experience in opera, written by the canon of dead white men. Alice Ping-Yi Ho, who we talked about in our second week, says that in the Peking and Cantonese operas she remembers watching growing up, the female characters always suffered. They were strong, but they always suffered. Now, kind of important to point out is that all of these roles are written by men. It's not to say that men can't write female characters, but truly a woman's experience is missing from the operatic canon. And this is something that in the operatic community right now we're really trying to fix. We're trying to get other perspectives put into these characters, and it's growing. And anyway, that's a whole other bag of worms. So now let's look at the treatment of women as performers in the opera. So now we're going to go back to the 17th century, and we're going to be in Francesca Caccini's time for a little bit here, who we are going to talk about. But a contemporary of hers said this: "When music combined with visual beauty, it served as a double invitation to the pleasures and dangers of love, for body and soul were thus twice besieged, and rational man deprived of his physical senses. Yeah. Sadly, this idea still exists, that men are not held accountable for their desires, right? It's really sad. Putting that aside for a little bit. So in Caccini's, in this worldview, every female musician operated under the shadow of this image, the whore, who used her magic to trap men and destroy them. Women were subjected to so-called virginity tests in attempts to stave off the horror of unchastity associated with their art. They considered that the throat was a sieve through which chastity leaked out, proving that the singer was anything but chaste. Now today, while we've moved on from assuming that any woman who opens her mouth is a whore, women opera singers are, they're also still quite discriminated against, and that they are not included in these critical decisions about their bodies on stage, like how they're going to be viewed, also their perspectives on playing iconic female roles in opera. For example, American soprano Megan Marie Hart's most performed role is Donna Anna from Don Giovanni. And she quite often feels excluded from the process of talking about Donna Anna's roles and motivations, especially where the issues at hand are something that only a woman would understand. She writes, "There is always this desire on the part of the directors and sometimes male colleagues to try and make Donna Anna not raped. I can't tell you how many directors have decided that Donna Anna wants to be raped by Don Giovanni and is in love with him, even though she has never seen him before. Donna Anna must be some lying, manipulative bitch. I think it is easier than actually asking me what I think and how I see it as a woman." So the opera industry is just riddled with body policing, how a woman dresses, how she looks. She's penalized for motherhood, middle age, not to mention how riddled it is with rampant fat phobia. So I've picked a rather long quote, but I love this. Lauren Margeson is so eloquent, amazing Canadian soprano, and she wrote this piece for Opera Canada, so I'm going to share a sizable chunk of it here with you. "Through veiled, caring language, I have been removed from shows because of my size. I have been told to my face that if I didn't lose weight, I couldn't hope for a career no matter how good a voice I had. I have been offered work contingent on my not gaining more weight. I have been surveyed with a sneer. I have been mocked, judged, passed over, and hurt simply because of my body fat percentage happened to be on the higher side. As my father has said countless times, why aren't people in bigger bodies allowed to love and be loved through the operatic lens? I echo his question with every fiber of my being. Why indeed? Somewhere along the line, it was decided that a larger body diminishes the believability of a story. The size of a body has no bearing on the ability to be desired. The size of a body has no bearing on the worth of the human or the abilities of the artist. One of the main reasons I fell in love with opera was due to its portrayal of human emotion. But until all humans are welcomed into that storytelling medium, the honesty is absent." With the spread of Me Too movement in 2017, women in the performing arts shared stories of sexual harassment and assault, and the lack of support and even retaliation when they reported these crimes. Many women have been left with feeling that they have to choose between either suffering silently while working next to their abuser or having to leave, only to never be hired again by that company, and even gaining this reputation as being difficult to work with. Mezzo-soprano Erin Elizabeth Smith expressed this shame and devaluation echoed by countless victims of sexual abuse. She writes, "I lost my confidence. The only reason I'm on his roster is that he wanted to sleep with me. It made me doubt my talent." And she continues, "I wasn't asked back after my first summer, even though I did an awesome job. And this was because a tenor was stalking me. The company decided to ask him back because they needed more tenors. Asking her back was too much drama. So they let him come back and left me in the lurch. I was devastated. I would have loved to have come back, but I felt like a failure, and it hurt so much to not be protected. It is high time that the men who are perpetuating these abuses are held accountable, and we as a society need to stop turning a blind eye in the name of, preserving sacred art, that whole excuse of, oh, I love the art, not the artist. And I mean, in some of these situations, we're talking about conductors and directors, but no, like, full stop, no, this atrocious treatment of women or any gender minority just needs to stop. End of story. I don't care what opera it is, what director it is, like, we need to just end this. End of story. So, to lighten the air a little bit, because that is quite heavy and unfortunately a reality for so many people, but I'm going to lighten the air a little with a story of Francesca Caccini dealing with someone who abused his power in the same way. In this patriarchal world, Caccini had her victories. The principal court poet, Andrea Salvadori, a good-looking womanizer, was renowned for accommodating the parts in the music to favor the one who was in his heart, or in other words, seducing young singers who would then get preferential treatment. Salvadori did not count on Caccini's response, as recounted by a contemporary writer, Cavalcante. They write, Francesca Caccini, a woman as fierce and restless as she was capable in singing and acting, could not abide this behavior and began to expose and talk about him, first in passing and behind his back, and then openly and to his face, revealing his intentions and designs and the origins of his favoritism. Caccini's whistleblowing led to Salvatore being disdained, at least for a time, by the Métis women, who were head of the court. And more importantly, his supply of singer victims dried up. Salvadori, unsurprisingly, vented his anger in the poem titled Donne musiche parlano dall'inferno, Women Musicians Speak from Hell, which was probably performed in court in early 1621. Caccini, equally unsurprisingly, was furious. So in the short term, the two were forced to make peace, but Caccini waited for her moment. 6 years later, Salvadori wrote a piece for the celebration of a noble marriage, over which he took great trouble. It had already been set to music, the stage machine sketched, and the parts assigned when Francesca took her best revenge, waiting for the worst place and time. Finding herself with the most serene bride, so the princess getting married, she sang the part that was to have been hers, and praised the verses and workmanship of it, adding, Serenissima, everything will go well, and I like it. I have only one remaining doubt. What is that? Prompted the princess. Caccini had her opening. She went on to suggest, delicately, that the plot could be construed as horribly offensive. Admittedly, this was a stretch, revolving around the idea that the male hero could be seen to be emasculated by the storyline. But stretch or no, the princess insisted that the entertainment be changed, and Salvadori was commanded to produce another comedy within 8 days. He in turn gained a petty revenge by creating the character of Discordia and casting Francesca in the role. But the narrator of this quarrel ends by writing, exulting at this, she always said that the response was not equal to the blow. Francesca Caccini knew she had won. So Francesca Caccini, one of the composers we're talking about today, born in 1587, and she is one of the very few women who may show up in an index of a book on music history, particularly the history of opera. So let's check this. Rough Guide to Opera. Nope. Story of Opera. Nope. The Enjoyment of Music. Oh, yes, but just like a very little, tiny, like 2-sentence blurb. History of Western Music. Yes. Nice, sizable paragraph. Now, usually she is mentioned in connection with her father, Giulio Caccini, who was one of the individuals involved with the original Italian opera. So in that Education of Music book, she is mentioned with her father, so, okay. But in that last textbook, She's not. Points. And sometimes, usually what's missing is that she was the first woman to compose opera. But happily, those 2 books that have her, that is not the case. So, win. So, one of the best-known musical families in Florence was the Caccini family. Her mother was Lucia de Filippo Gagnolandi, and she had a beautiful singing voice that Fran is said to have inherited. Sadly, she died when Fran was 5. Her stepmother was Margherita di Agostino della Scala, and in the singing world, she was known as Bargiali, another talented singer in the Caccini family. And her father was Giulio Caccini, a singer, talented, and ambitious, and kind of a jerk. So Giulio was the second most highly paid composer and musician on the staff of the Medici household. He was renowned as this author of the most influential singing manual of the 17th century, La Nuova Musique. But he was proud to the point of self-destruction. Once he was put under house arrest for refusing to acknowledge a social superior on the street. His love of gambling made it hard for him to support his, at guest, 10 children by 3 women. He sought to dominate his family simply for the sake of it. For example, once he withheld the dowry of Fran's sister Settimia. In 1611, he finally paid the dowry when her new husband's family abducted her and held her for ransom in the city of Lucca. Great guy. Anyway, so the entire Caccini family, they were all musical, and they were featured in public performances in order to showcase Giulio's exceptional talents as a composer and teacher. So I kind of like to think of them as the Caccini family singers. Anyway. Oh, side note, there's a really good documentary about the Von Trapps on YouTube called Climb Every Mountain, narrated by Sue Perkins. Highly recommend it. Anyway, total aside. So it was Francesca's exceptional musical talent that offered Giulio his greatest opportunity. But Francesca was educated in both music and literature, Latin and contemporary languages. She also studied geometry, philosophy, and astrology. She was a poet, singer, and she played the harp, guitar, and keyboard. And she was also educated in composition. And at this time, they used this to help the performances of singers. It was expected that singers could improvise in their performances and on occasion perform their own song settings, so taking a well-known text and creating a new melody or song for it. Just gonna have a sip of water here. So Fran's first introduction to the court spectacle was at age 13, on October 9th, 1600, when the Caccini family singers performed Giulio's Il Rapimento di Cavallo at the Uffizi Palace. And so this was part of some proxy celebrations of the wedding of Henry IV and Marie de Medici. It was to be the grandest spectacle of the 1600 winter season. The opera was 5 hours long. Well, not an opera, sorry, the performance, the entertainment was 5 hours long, with a cost of production at 60,000 scudi, which is around 300 years of salary for Fran's father. That's a lot of money. But this is the best. It was overshadowed by Jacopo Peri's Eurodice, performed at the Medici Pitti Palace, same time. I also like that it's called a Pitti Palace. Don't mind me. So, fast forward 4 years, in 1604, King Henry IV and Queen Marie de Medici asked the rulers of Tuscany if they could borrow the Caccinis for a few months. And the nobility would sort of swap their musicians with one another, kind of like trading cattle or property. So the Caccinis, with 2 carriages and 6 mules, took off on a 2-month journey to Paris. When Fran sang, Henry IV declared her the best singer in France, and Fran was offered a salaried position at court. Queen Marie was quite keen to secure her for her own at court, so she was willing to provide the other sister, i.e. Settimia, with a dowry. And convention at this time was to provide both a job and a husband to female musicians. Now, because Giulio didn't want to lose his investment, he thwarted the opportunity. He gave the impression to the royals that the Grand Duke of Tuscany had refused Caccini permission to accept his job for Francesca. But Caccini was not yet on at the Medici court. So that opportunity was gone. But this trip still provided Francesca with more musical education, but also with a social education, like understanding how to survive the vagaries of high politics or working with elite families. So as Francesca is coming into her own as a singer and a composer, a very unique change of power is happening in the Medici court. At that time, the Medici family was led by Grand Duchess Christine de Lorraine. She had been married to Grand Duke Ferdinand, and as he became ill, Christine began to kind of like flex her muscles. Once he died, her power did not wane, despite their son Cosimo II succeeding. Cosimo had had bad health, and he was confined to bed for a month at a time. Therefore, Christine remained the de facto leader of the Medici state. Then Cosimo dies, and Christine's daughter-in-law, the Archduchess Maria Magdalena of Austria, became the principal regent. And as their son Ferdinand was only 11 years old, these women are staying in charge. So Francesca was truly in the right place at the right time, a woman composer for what was becoming a woman's court. So France's breakthrough with composition came in 1607, where she wrote a barriera, which is a dance representation of a battle, so kind of like a ballet battle. How cool would that be? It was titled L'Estavia. Sadly, the music doesn't survive. It was scripted by the great nephew of the Michelangelo, Michelangelo Buonarroti. And he chose Fran to write the music. She wasn't even 20 years old yet. So with the advice and consent of her father, Fran seized the opportunity. Meantime, I'm just going to skip this bit. That's too bad. So after the success of this piece, Christine de Lorraine appointed Francesca as La Musica to the Grand Duke of Tuscany on November 5th, 1607. And this is a big deal. I personally don't know of any other woman becoming a court composer. Like La Musica is the court composer. Like for example, if we think back to the first time we did Herstory, and I talked about Elizabeth Jacquet de la Guerre, she worked in the court of King Louis, but she was not La Musica. La Musica was Lully. Pretty awesome. So I've just listed some of Fran's duties there, but of note, she would be writing operas in days or weeks. Like, that is insane to me. Like, people take years to write opera now. Days or weeks writing operas and then revising, because lots of the times the patrons would just they'd want to change it on the fly, and they had to. Now this I found rather interesting, and it's as to why we didn't always find things about Caccini beforehand in terms of her accomplishments. While she had some public events, these were much more rare than private events, and some of the private events would be something like performing for Christine's daughter-in-law, Maria Magdalena, to celebrate a successful childbirth. And so because so many of her works were in private concerts, this is why her achievements have not been acknowledged in these traditional music histories. Also, there was a lot of massive court spectacles that were created. Like, they were huge affairs, and they would be created by a long list of collaborators. So there'd be poets, like plural, composers, plural, singers, painters, architects, seamstresses, etc., etc. And so it's just a small cog in the wheel. It was only too easy for a woman's name to slip off of the credits. So it's only now that musical scholars are starting to uncover some more of Caccini's significant compositions or things she contributed to. So in 1618, Francesca published her first and only volume of arias, Il Primo Libro della Musique. And this was a book of music written by a woman, for a woman, which is really important because that wasn't always a thing. Or like, as time goes on, right? It's quite rare for us to see this. Also of importance is that the first publication by a woman dates back to only 1566, so it's still pretty new for women to be publishing music. So Il Primo offered examples of every genre that the female solo singer needed to master, revealing some tricks of the musica's trade, such as confidently playing with gender, like with her piece Ardo in Felice, which is a gender neutral piece. That the gender is is concealed, and so you can have all these different lovely combinations of who the singer is and who they're singing to. Another one of the tricks in the book was to teach her reader how to sing about desire without acknowledging any knowledge of desire, because the throat is a sieve leaking out all chastity. So why was there never a second book? It's most likely because the Medicis did not allow it, because really Fran was their musical servant. Any publication that she created in their service needed to be about them. So it's with that in mind, it's even more impressive that Il Primo appeared at all. So by 1623, she was the highest paid singer at court. And that year and the next, she earned more than anyone else except the Duke's secretary. 2 years later, at the age of 36, Francesca will write a huge court spectacle that is the most associated with her today, mostly because it's like one of the only things that survives. So, February 3rd, 1625, the Medici court is celebrating a great military victory over the Ottoman Turks by Crown Prince Vladislav Sigismund Vasa of Poland, who is their honored guest. As it is carnival time in Florence, a lavish, spectacular entertainment is needed. So Maria Magdalena commissions a new work by Francesca, and that is La Liberazione di Ruggiero dall'Isola Alcina. My Italian is not getting any better. Anyway, so this work explores the theme of women in power with good and evil sorceresses. And for the women rulers of the Medici state, La Liberazione stood as a high-risk attempt to confront head-on the sexually focused but politically grounded fears and fantasies that surrounded women in power. So La Liberazione was taken from a recent gynophobic poem, so like Fear of Women, and the story is of the wicked sorceress Alcina, who seduces the knight Ruggiero, entrapping him on her island in order to take her pleasure. Whereas still, he and a host of other previous victims seem to enjoy the experience. But the good sorceress, Melissa, triumphs over Alcina and liberates Ruggiero and his fellow captives. She dresses as a man and infiltrates Alcina's island, i.e. playing with gender, which is a risky concept at this time, especially considering that Christine de Lorraine was also associated with a house that had almost been denunciated because of lesbian activity, which was considered a threat to the patriarchy. The Medici women then take this risk even further by having the final scene end with a claim that men and women are fundamentally equal. So we're going to listen to a little bit of this opera. So of note, this is an early opera, and so it's not going to be in that standard form of opera that we recognize today with the recitative and the aria. But what we will get to see is a little bit of acting style versus singing style. And the excerpt we are listening to was from the Opera McGill performance just a couple years ago, and it was directed by the indubitably amazing Jessica Cervantes. So take note in the background of these frames on the wall. This was Jess's staging, which has that she filled with Alcina's ex-lovers who she was bored with and just trapped. So it's like living people in these frames. So I will get Matt to now play you a little clip of La Liberazione.
Con lumine Suavissime fiamme, i vivi strani, che il suo nuovo desio tronchinollani. E porgeva a noi, bella regina, or vedrem come pote, con dolce lacrimar, nella divina. Ferma, ferma, crudele, oh, veni mai spiegato, toglimi, lasci ingrato, in preda e pianto. Raffredda almen con tanto la furia delle partite, e d'immenso dolor l'anima incida. Primir al pianto mio, sentire strida, senti le giustissime querele, ferma, ferma, crudele, e queste nubi che pur ora chiamavi stelle e soli, mira qual son per te conversi in fiumi. Specchiati in questo viso, dove la gioia e il riso avean la sede, vedrai la tua mancanza e la mia fede, e che tra pene quando desto il mondo e
So I'm going to fast forward quite a bit, but here are a few key details. Fran's first husband, Giovanni, dies. By the way, they have a daughter named Margarita. Fran remarries, moves to Lucha, has a son, the new husband dies. After the death of the new husband, Fran wants to return to Florence because Florence is home. So she was eventually given permission to return by the Métis. So the plan is set. They're finally going to get to go home. But then, plague! The living nightmare of the 17th century arrived in Lucha. Desperate attempts were made to placate an angry god with St. Antonio's remains borne through the city. 400 people were cured, but it was a temporary respite. Women and children under 16 were forbidden to leave their homes, with just one person from the household permitted to go out for provisions. This sounds vaguely familiar. Oh, but they could only go out for provisions on a Tuesday or Friday. There were to be no assemblies and gatherings of people in times of contagion. Schools were closed, and all games and entertainment stopped. By August 1631, 8,000 people had died in Lucha alone, 1/3 of the population. Francesca Caccini and her son and daughter survived. At last, in February 1633, almost three years after her husband's death, the quarantine was lifted and return home beckoned, only to be prevented by a further outbreak of plague, this time in Florence. More months passed. At last, probably late in 1633 or early in 1634, Francesca Caccini was able to return home to her professional life as a singer, teacher, and composer. Of all the things I expected to have in common with a composer, I was not expecting that one. So yeah, had to share that. This took way longer than in my practice, so we're gonna skip ahead to talking about what composers are doing today. And for this one, we get to talk about Nkeiru Okoye. And one of the things that I really love about Nkeiru's works is that they are about strong women, not the typical tragic arm candy of the past. For example, she has a piece for orchestra and narrator about the first African American poet, Phyllis Wheatley, and it's called The Journey of Phyllis Wheatley. You know, the name's in the title. And then the work of Nkeiru's that we are going to focus on today is about Harriet Tubman. So Nkeiru's genre-bending compositions reflect a dizzying array of influences: Gilbert and Sullivan, the Gershwins, Sondheim, Copland, gospel, jazz, and Schoenberg. She writes, "My music doesn't fit easily into a style category. It's surprising to see how well Schoenberg and funk can sit side by side at the symphony." So Nkeiru was born in New York, New York, to an African-American mother and a Nigerian father. She spent her early childhood traveling between Nigeria and the United States, but she was primarily raised on Long Island. When her parents separated, Nkeiru and her older sister remained with their mother on Long Island. Nkeiru's mother really wanted her and her sister to embrace their life as individuals. She didn't want them to know that there was any stigma or limitation as a result of their skin color. She didn't use the term Black growing up. They were Nigerian and American. So as a child, Nkeiru said that she just heard music. She remembers making up her own songs and singing lines in her children's books, like Beatrix Potter. She's also drawn to the piano, and then in school orchestra, she went on to play oboe, alto sax, and glockenspiel. I kind of want to write a piece for that combination. That would be so random. Anyway, so a turning point came for her in junior high when she had all this music in her head, and so she asked her band director to help her write it down. So then that piece, she entered into the NAACP composition contest and took first prize. So the National Association of Advancement of Colored People was a civil rights organization formed in 1909 by a group including Webb Du Bois, Mary White Ovington, Moorfield Story, and Ida B. Wells. In grade 9, Nkeiru started studying piano at the Manhattan School of Music, the preparatory division. So most students, they started their formal studies at grade 5 or 6, and she had taken lessons in grade school, but she hadn't really begun studying seriously. She writes, "As far as they were concerned, I was completely untrained. They even told her that she'd never be a pianist." But despite the naysayers, Nkeiru attended Saturday classes at the Manhattan School while continuing her regular studies at public school in Amityville, New York. She went on to get a Bachelor of Music in Composition from the Oberlin Conservatory of Music. She also completed additional studies in piano and West African culture, and she has a master's and a PhD in music theory and composition from Rutgers University, where she studied with Noel DaCosta. Now Nkeiru is a composer, conductor, music consultant, researcher, historian, and a board member of Composers Now. Suck it, naysayers! So, I'm so excited about this opera. Harriet Tubman, When I Crossed That Line to Freedom. It was commissioned by the American Opera Projects with generous support from the National Endowments for the Arts Artworks grant, and the libretto and music are by Nkeiru. That is a huge thing. Like, most people have a librettist do the libretto writing, so the words, and then the music is done by a composer. To take on both is huge. That's massive. She's like awesome. So the work was finished in 2012, 8 years after the project began. Very different from the 1 or 2 days that Francesca got, but I mean, this is way better. I mean, I love Brit. They're all awesome. So, synopsis. Harriet Tubman is a 2-act theatrical work that tells of how a young girl born in slavery becomes Harriet Tubman, the legendary Underground Railroad conductor. Based on recent Tubman biographies, the story is told in the context of Tubman's tight-knit family of lively characters. Harriet Tubman carries the universal themes of sisterhood, courage, sacrifice, and doing what is necessary to keep a family together. Moreover, it is a heartwarming tale of two sisters vowing that nothing but death will separate them, despite the slavery threatening to tear them apart. So if you ask Nkeiru how she came to write an opera, you will receive a megawatt smile and an admission, I didn't know any better. She says writing an opera is the most exhilarating and exhausting project she's ever taken on. This project would span 8 years, but it began, she was envisioning it sort of as an oratorio, which is, it's like a staged choir thing. Think Handel's Messiah. There you go. So while in development, though, Nkeiru created a song cycle, which is a collection of songs based on a theme that can be sung independently. And so these are 4 arias from the opera. But then 2012, this piece would be launched as a full-scale opera. She started the project in Maryland, and Nkeiru was looking to write something about a heroine, a noted historical figure, and she was torn between Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman. But since Harriet had lived in Maryland, it seemed a natural choice to go with Tubman for the opera. Also, Nkeiru found Harriet very fascinating, and she just really likes fascinating people. And she wanted to tell Harriet's story. Why would she risk her freedom going up and down the coast? So she used her recovery time from a car accident to scour past and present accounts of Tubman and her time. She says, I just poured myself into the research. The claims about her were so large, it was hard to know what she did do. Nkeiru continues, Harriet is said to have personally led thousands of people to freedom and to have set up the Underground Railroad practically single-handedly. I spent more than a year researching her life, and to me that sounds like an urban legend. So there's a lot of accounts, and some of them weren't much better than fiction. So Nkeiru was determined to find out who Harriet actually was for herself, so she could share it with other people. As she was researching, her eyes were opened to this wealth of historical and cultural misinformation, the poisoned result of racism and ignorance. She also found that there were a lot of discrepancies in various accounts on Harriet. Hardly any people would let her speak for herself. So Nkeiru writes, often when we talk about Tubman, she's a heroine, but it's not personal. We don't really understand what it cost her to be that way. Tubman's repeated dangerous trips to Maryland were prompted by the wish to free the members of her family. Other slaves would join her, swelling the size of the group. She wasn't actually trying to be a hero, she just wanted to save her family. But Harriet believed in working together, in education, no matter the situation. She was proud of who she was. She didn't believe there were any limitations on her. And I love this. I love this for a female character in opera, like full, rounded, strong woman. Like, yeah, so good. This is where opera needs to continue heading. So included in the opera are also forgotten anti-slavery African-American heroes like the Underground Railroad station master, William Still, and the freedman, Samuel Green, both of whose lives importantly intertwined with Harriet's. There's a scene with William Still teaching sort of the code of the Underground Railroad to individuals. So Nkeiru in an interview made a reference to the coded spirituals, where the lyrics were embedded with hidden messages alerting slaves to coming escapes or routes to freedom. For example, the spiritual wade in the water tells you that the best way to avoid capture if dogs are chasing you. So Nkeiru's research also included looking at what kind of music Harriet would have heard. She wanted the music to be Harriet's music. Harriet would not have been singing bel canto opera. Just not happening. So she wanted it to sound like you were listening to folk music, spirituals, work songs. Ragtime was just beginning at this time. There would have been some classical forms like dances and sonatinas. Nkeiru really wanted the music to reflect this time. And then in regard to the song cycle, each song incorporates a different style of African-American music. So the third song in the cycle, / this amazing aria that we're about to listen to, it's a gospel aria, but Nkeiru says that she cheated a little bit with that aria since in Tubman's time, gospel hadn't been invented yet, but it just works. So Matt's going to set up this aria here for us. We only have time to listen to a little bit of it. It's so good. But it's called I Am Harriet Tubman, Free Woman. So good. So at the performance, Nkeiru had an audience member come up to her, saying, "Oh, I didn't think I'd like opera, but this was so good." And so Nkeiru says it was so fantastic to hear how she'd been touched by the opera. And that's what I'm aiming for, to make opera that regular people can enjoy and appreciate. I've listed quite a few little factoids here about her because, definitely running out of time. So I wanted to kind of round out all of the Herstory class with a quote here. This is from Dr. C.N. Lester's book, Trans Like Me. So I'm taking a little bit out of context, but kind of just looking at stopping our obsession with a binary, that one gender does something better than another gender. And so I'm going to read a little quote here from Dr. Lester's book. From the very first, our idea of oppositional binary sex is undetermined by two simple truths: that we are all formed from the same material, and that there are more than two patterns for our potential shaping. Not only are male and female far more similar than they are different, but there are many ways in which these themes can be combined and developed. This is no two-part invention, but a full-blown symphony. Rather than possessing distinct genital differences from the get-go, we all begin with the same base potentiality. And I love that, same base potentiality. We all have the same opportunity to be musicians, to be carpenters, to be whatever. And gender's got nothing to do with that. So I hope this class has helped us see the amazing contributions of women. I also hope that we can stop talking about things in terms of men versus women, because then we exclude people that we don't want to do. But yeah. Anyway, thank you. Oh yeah, definitely read Dr. Lester's book. It's so good. I'm just gonna give us a plug because I love their book. If you want to get a really good, just sort of insight into trans life, and they word things so clearly and so smart in a way that's just entertaining. Anyway, I'm not supposed to be doing a book club, but it's a really good book. Read it. And with that, are there any questions about opera? Oh, how do I stop this? Here we go. Stop share. It is a quiet audience tonight. That's totally true. Giving time for the typing. Ooh, this is a question from Rosemary. Have any women rewritten a classical opera? That is such a niche question. Okay, Matt said I should have done this last day, but I'll do it now. A little plug. It's not at all the same thing, but the Symphony is having a concert next Thursday called Mozart Reimagined. So we've taken a bunch of Mozart operas, and there have been 4 Saskatoon composers involved in this, and they've rewritten a few of them. And then Danica Loren has created a whole new story with a whole bunch of different arias. So in that sense, I guess, kind of rewriting a classical opera. Yeah, I mean, there's maybe a better answer to this question is there are lots of stories that kind of get reused. For example, oh man, shameless plug. Let's look at Orpheus and Eurydice. That has been done to death by every single composer that ever lived, myself not excluded. I did a comic version of Orpheus and Eurydice that actually kind of misses all of the major plot points. And I'm actually going to be working on another one this summer. Not because I love Orpheus, it's just my librettist partner has an amazing idea for it. I'm not going to go into that. Anyway, so there's probably lots of stories that have been rewritten. I by no means know all of the living or even classical canon for that matter. Oh, here we go. Have any of the Canadian opera companies performed any works by women composers? Well, Opera Miguel has done Caccini's La Liberazione. I don't know what all like COC, Canadian Opera Company, has done. Yeah, I don't know what everyone's what's sorry, I'm fading everyone. I don't know everyone's repertoire list. I will say I've seen in some companies a lot of repeats of old white canon, but I do see new stuff coming out. Your best bet for like new opera is like in our indie companies. They produce some of the most exciting stuff. Yeah. Any last questions? Oh, and by the way, if you do think of another question, please feel free to reach out to me on social media and ask. I'd be more than willing to attempt to look it up. Oh, actually, sorry, I meant to mention this after the aria from Harriet Tubman. On my website, I've created a link to American Opera Projects. I have a playlist of a whole bunch of different arias and performances from different types of performances of the Harriet Tubman opera. Definitely check it out. It's so good. Not to mention on Nkeiru's SoundCloud, there is a cast recording on there. Yes. Oh, yes. Against the Grain would be one of those great companies. You've got Opera 5, you've got Amplified Opera. Yeah, Toronto is like the scene for new opera right now. One day. Oh, yes. And as always, I've got a playlist. Check out kendraharder.com. I've got a playlist there for Herstory. And I also have a playlist for the trans and non-binary composers. So also check that one out. Any final questions? Oh, yes, Matt put a link there in the chat to check out Mozart Reimagined there. Oh yeah, I guess I could be a little self-promotional. I did do one of the arias, and it's like really sarcastic and charming like me. And I also did some arrangements, which was really fun. Thank you, SSO, for that gig, by the way. I love arranging. Yeah, but with that, please reach out. I am about to enter a composition hole of opera, so I won't be as present on the social media, but please, I'd love to hear more questions and chat with you all. Thank you so much for being such active participants and for joining us and for listening. Yeah, you guys all have a superb summer, and so long, farewell, auf Wiedersehen, good. I mean, that's opera, but whatever. I mean, that's music theater. All right, ciao, everyone.